And the reason why we're talking about that, because everybody that needs to hear that any degree of what we would call dysglycemia, right? Any degree of not having properly regulated blood sugar is bad for your health and leads to lots of other diseases before you even have to worry about diabetes. Welcome to the True Health Solutions podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Lonnie Bagwell, stress, inflammation, and functional health clinician.
And I'm your co-host, Brigitte Spurgeon, metabolism and nutrition expert.
This podcast is where we bring hope, truth, and inspiration for your holistic health journey.
Because the world needs the best version of you.
Hello, and welcome to True Health Solutions podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Lonnie Bagwell, here with
Brigitte Spurgeon.
Brigitte Spurgeon. And we are going to talk about a topic today that we, in one way or another, either directly or indirectly deal with on a daily basis. It's something that we've actually spent a bunch of time looking at with ourselves, just because we're always biohacking, learning, whatever you want to call it. And we're talking about a topic that is linked to all major diseases. And we were just saying right before we hopped on this recording that it's one of the easiest things to make a positive impact with. And so today we're talking about blood sugar. And I think that I want to come right out of the gate and say that this topic is for every single person that has ears to hear, because we're not talking about, this is not the diabetes episode. This is about blood sugar in general. And frankly, honestly, most of what we're talking about today doesn't even go beyond the pre-diabetic. We're actually really not even talking about diabetes today. We're actually talking about blood sugar truly and everything that leads to pre-diabetes and diabetes. And the reason why we're talking about that, because everybody that needs to hear that any degree of what we would call dysglycemia, right? Any degree of not having properly regulated blood sugar is bad for your health and leads to lots of other diseases before you even have to worry about diabetes, right? And so, and again, we see it every single day where people will come in and say, wow, so quickly, I feel better because, and the truth is all we did was balance out their blood sugar a little bit. That's why they're feeling so much better, so much faster. Right. And then we're getting into the calls and, affecting other more targeted conditions or whatnot. Right. And so, so to be clear for all of our listeners, I just want to help them understand how we're categorizing this. Dysglycemia is anything that's out of normal balance of blood glucose. Okay. If you stay dysglycemic enough out of your day, your week, your month, your year, then you're developing some degree of decreased insulin sensitivity, or what we would call insulin resistance. That is largely the symptoms that we see related to a lot of conditions that walk through the door, right? They almost, I don't know, I want to say almost every, it might be almost every. It's a large percentage of patients who come in there to some degree insulin resistant. And I've experienced this in my life, so I can speak to, the symptoms and such with that. And then but like most Americans, they're not walking through the door of this office or calling us, reaching out. So then they're progressing into pre-diabetes. And that's usually where people are finding out, oh my gosh, I have some blood sugar issues, but really they've been dealing with it for years to decades prior to that, right? So just before we get into, kind of what it causes and everything, is there anything that you want to kind of add anecdotally to that intro, Brigitte?
Well, I actually just wanted to add that, 60 to 80% of Americans are insulin resistant. And
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people have no clue that they have this disease marker, in their blood work or, going on in their physiology that is putting them at risk for the major killers and major diseases. And, we're talking about, the cancer, the heart disease, and, and the things that I think a lot of people fear, like Alzheimer's and, certainly cancer and autoimmune and things like that. So this is a vital topic that we all need to adhere to, and we need to get this under control before a diagnosis is on the horizon. And I was just talking to one of our team members earlier today. We're talking about a couple of deaths happened to men in their low 40s. And I just said to LaDonna, I said, we have to be reaching people earlier.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
The fact that people are dying of heart failure and liver failure at in their low 40s, we got some problems going on there.
Yeah, inflammation, is what pops into my head because I was just thinking of X-rays that I showed. I showed X-rays. I showed two sets of X-rays in the last 2 days. Both had arthritis. They're 20-year age difference, but the X-rays really looked almost identical. So someone that's in their 30s, someone's in their 50s, and they look the same. And so it's not about age dependent. It's that has a lot to do with inflammation of those joints, and then and blood sugar has to do with systemic inflammation. And it's one of the reasons I posted this on our Facebook page to kind of stimulate our patients' thinking is, why do we say you're fighting a virus or a bacteria? First thing we're going to do is cut out the sugar, until you recover. Why? Because it suppresses the immune system. Sugar does, right? Or if someone says, I'm having a lot of pain, one of the first things we'll say is, we need to drop the sugar for a few days until we get this inflammation under control, because it contributes to the pain sticking around longer. So just as widespread as those two examples are, dysregulation or dysglycemia, so unregulated blood sugar, but not diabetic level, causes things like mood disorders. So this is the research that I was looking up earlier today. Mood disorders, including depression and anxiety, directly linked to your blood sugar levels, even if it's subdiabetic. Hormones being disrupted significantly by dysregulated blood sugar, and even specifically endometriosis is directly linked to your blood sugar levels. And of course, the one that most people realize on the back end of diabetes is typically on the back end is like your diabetic neuropathy and vascular damage, right? But long before you ever have destroyed nerve endings and destroyed capillaries and blood vessels, you have damaged nerve endings and degrading nerve endings, and that happens over a period of years to decades. So when your blood sugar is off, even on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis, but sub-diabetic, we're still having those hits to our immune system, those hits to our nervous system, digestive system, et cetera, et cetera. It literally affects every system in the body. And in the extreme ends, you may not even be diabetic, but you could have had so much dysglycemia and insulin resistance, which we'll talk about here in a second more, that it's affecting your brain to where they're calling Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes, right? So you might not even be diabetic elsewhere diagnosably, but have had so much blood sugar dysregulation that happens to be affecting your brain that we start to see early onset dementia, things like that. So this is, to agree with you, this is a huge topic that affects absolutely every human that has ears to hear it. And so the top measure, just so everybody knows, you've already heard of this, but to explain to you a little more what it is, the top way to measure if you're doing a good job of regulating your blood sugar is an HbA1c. Now, of course, we always look at functional ranges, not just the medical ranges, right? And so I'm going to go over those here in a second. But HbA1c is a measure of how good you've done in the last 90 days. So it's an excellent measure of you over time, of being able to balance out your blood sugar and keep it within a certain percentage range. And so if your HbA1c is between 5 and 5.5, that's considered good. If you're 5.5 to 6.4, that's falling into what we would consider to be the pre-diabetic range. And then anything above 6.5 or above, and that these are, everybody will use a little different scale, but that's going to be your diabetic range. Or I like what you said, above 7, I think you said is just uncontrolled diabetes at that point, right?
Yes.
And I even see, looking at a lot of blood work nowadays, we'll see, oh yeah, I'm doing good with my diabetes. I'm on these medications and stuff. I've been holding around 6.5. And it's so frustrating because it's like, well, that's full blown diabetes, but like, why can't we do something to get it down into normal functional range so that you don't have to be, dysfunctionally managed diabetes? Why can't you be fully functional managed diabetes is almost always the conversation that I have, because by the time we're talking to people, and obviously if they're coming to us, they're having health issues, but, like even when we're managing it, all we're doing is keeping the dysfunctional car rolling down the road. We're not fixing the car at all, right? So it's just a busted vehicle that we're happy that it's still rolling, right? Which would be a standard we wouldn't accept anywhere else in our lives. But, that's like a big victory in a lot of these patients' minds, according to their doctors. So anyway, anything to say about the functional ranges?
We can look at it in the terms of longevity. If you want a long and vitalistic life, you want to keep that range in 5 between 5 and 5.5. That's the range that has been studied for the best longevity outcome. So if you're sitting at a 5.8 and you think you're okay because you're under that 6, and that's technically pre-diabetic, but maybe you're not on a medication and you're just flirting with that line, that is not optimal for longevity. And I also should add that some people fall below a 5, and there can be a genetic component to that. Actually, Dr. Bagwell, I think you might have some of those genetics, if I remember correctly.
Mm-hmm.
Or that could be someone that has followed very restrictive, very low carb nutrition for an extended time. I literally have seen patients fall at like a 4.8 or even a little under that. And that's not net. If you're like eating 0 carbs for 6 months, personally, I'm not necessarily saying that's like the healthiest way to live. So that's why we say that the 5 to the 5.5.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's good. And mine's been as low as 4.7. So we have to kind of work on my insulin levels and insulin receptors and things like that to help bring it up that way. And we're already talking about, we're kind of already leaning into some of the solutions. Like we recommend this, we'll do that. But the medical approach to this is the same as any other. You could watch any of our videos. It's the same thing. It's treat the symptom, right? And so even the nutritional recommendations, which everybody knows that we're going to say, and we'll go in a little bit deeper, that nutrition is one of the best ways that you can obviously reverse this dysglycemia issue. But medicine will even recommend food to maintain your diabetes. Like they don't even actually use the term reverse. That's not even in their language at all. Okay, so we're just going to help you maintain your blood sugar now that you're diabetic. And it gives me tingles. Like it makes me feel icky even to say that out loud, because we've accidentally fixed more dysglycemia without even focusing on it. Like we're doing nutritional things for these other more significant health issues over here, more pressing or urgent health issues over here. And as a side effect of that, their HbA1c over the next 90 days just looks pristine. It wasn't even what we were trying to do. And yet their doctor was ready to put them on metformin, right? So it's almost like on accident, we're hydrating people, they're getting sleep. All of a sudden, next thing you know, their blood sugar starts to regulate, and it's like, well, we accidentally, corrected that blood sugar issue. But the medical approach, contrary to that, so on accident, we're helping so many people over here. And I was just going to pull this up real quick. So one of their proposed treatments, and it's still in the market today, was Avandia. And in 2007, the New England Journal of Medicine reported that if you were taking Avandia, you had a 43% increased risk of heart attack. Now, we haven't talked about the connection between dysglycemia and the heart, but I will go back and talk about that here in a minute. But just this one drug, on top of already having a blood sugar issue, now you're going to take a drug that you're literally trying to fix your blood sugar. The main reason is so you reduce your cardiac risk. And here's a drug that increases your risk of heart attack by 43%. And you have a 64% higher risk of some type of cardiovascular death, if not the heart attack, which is crazy. And it was 80,000 people suffered strokes, heart failure, and other heart complications while taking Avandia. And it took them 10 years of prescribing it, just pushing Avandia. It took 10 years before they didn't remove it. They just regulated it more. So I just can't come up with a scenario where it makes sense to take something that increases 43%, 60-some percent. Now, you make your own decisions. We're not giving you medical advice or telling you to take a medication or not. That's outside of our scope. I'm just reporting on what the New England Journal of Medicine says, and they say that it was crazy how many people had to die just to even get it regulated, let alone pulled off the shelf. It reminds me of things like Vioxx and this crazy drugs of the past that became black box drugs. Instead of pulling them, they kept them going. And even for those people that are listening, they're saying, well, yeah, I don't take that, but I've been taking metformin. Even like I think I said this earlier, but even when they recommend metformin for people, it actually doesn't do it by itself. They actually tell you have to do metformin and change your lifestyle. And if you do both of these things, it'll regulate your blood sugar. Well, metformin causes nausea, diarrhea, wrecks your gut. Other side effects, toxicity to liver, but you still have to do the lifestyle stuff for it to actually work or work for any length of time before they up the dose or change the drug. And so if you ask better questions, you get better answers. And if you say, well, wait a minute, what's the metformin do? And what if I don't do lifestyle changes? Then your doctor, according to the drug company, is going to have to say, well, then it probably isn't going to work. And then you would say, well, then it probably wasn't doing anything anyway, right? And I think about that, and I don't know how many millions of people are on metformin right now, but the bottom line is that we have to get into what the solution is, regardless, the real solution, and get to the cause regardless of whether you're on some kind of a medical intervention or not. And so, so one quick thing before we jump into what the solutions are for insulin resistance and such, is that idea of the HbA1c, because I was just taking an exam to finish a certification I'm doing, and the question was, what's the let me get the exact word here. What is the epidemiological number one independent risk factor for cardiovascular events such as myocardial infarction, heart attack, stroke, or coronary heart disease and heart failure on your blood work? That was the question, how it was worded. And the answer is HbA1c. So to summarize, the number one biomarker on your basic blood work that you get all the time, your CBC, that is the top predictor of whether you would have a heart attack, stroke, or some kind of cardiovascular failure, is your blood sugar regulation over the last 90 days. So here we have, to frame this, here we have HbA1c, blood sugar. That is the number one biomarker to predict the number one disease killer. It's the number one fuel for cancer, the number two disease killer, while it alone sits as the number 3 or 4 disease killer, maybe behind other cardiovascular events or whatever at number 3. So we're literally, when we're talking about blood sugar dysregulation, we're literally talking about the number 4 that is the number one predictor of the number 1, the number 1 fuel for number 2, and also the number 1 underlying cause of the number 3, if we were looking at stroke, diseases and causes of death. So if there was one thing you were going to focus on, you would focus on blood sugar first.
And we have to recognize what the HbA1c is indicative of. So it's indicative of our average blood glucose over the last 90 days. But what determines that? The food that we eat. Mm-hmm. And so when we take that medication, and I'm just basing this on what I observe clinically with patients coming in. When they go on a medication, it might lower their. So if their A1C was an 8, it might lower it, but get it into a managed range. But I rarely see someone who is diabetic on a medication sit between a 5 and a 5.5. But I very often, when someone changes their nutrition and when they lose weight, I will see it go to a 5.5. So we, once again, we have to recognize that one of the most powerful things that we can do to reduce the risk of disease and death lies in our daily nutrition.
Yes. And so what takes dysglycemia, kind of general day-to-day dysglycemia, into full-on, like, significant insulin resistance? We talked about several things. You mentioned, talk a little bit about carbs, because people need to hear that when we're talking about blood sugar. And then and also frequency. And then I just want to touch really quickly on just 2 more things that I think would give us, like, the top things that drive us into insulin resistance.
Yeah, so when you are getting high blood glucose spikes, and that is going to come from either the amount of foods and carbs that you're eating, so if you're eating a very large meal, or if you're eating a high sugar. So that honestly could even be because you can eat a candy bar that is high sugar, and that could only be 220 calories, but it's going to spike the blood glucose. So when the blood glucose remains high, it's requiring the pancreas to produce more insulin. And so now it just gets used to producing that higher insulin. So someone who's insulin resistant, they will oftentimes have 5 to 7 times the amount of normal insulin levels in their system. Now, I should note, being a weight loss specialist, is that when your insulin is high, your body cannot burn fat. That is telling your body to store fat. So that is a recipe for obesity right there or fatty liver disease.
Right.
And so that's the main and the obvious one. The other thing that a lot of people don't understand is actually can be food timing. So that is snacking throughout the day or having like small meals throughout the day. And it's interesting because that was recommended a couple of decades ago to regulate blood glucose, because they said, well, if you had a 300 calorie meal, 5 times a day, you're not going to have the carb cravings and the hunger.
Mm-hmm.
So doing to regulate it. But what ends up happening with that is we overuse our cell receptors and our metabolic system. So it gets tired and burned out because it's just getting used throughout the day. And so I'm a big fan of less meals. I disagree with snacking. I don't like the concept of snacking. I believe that idea of snacking was perpetuated by Food Inc. trying to sell their goldfish and their bars and all their snack foods, right?
Yeah.
And so snacking is the worst thing for our metabolism and I believe will set us up for insulin resistance. So that's on the carb side of things. Then you look at cell physiology, and you look at the integrity of the cell membrane is so important. And so when our bodies are inflamed and when we're consuming toxins, chemicals, and damaged fats, things like canola oil, soybean oil, vegetable oils, that disrupts the integrity of those cell membranes and also sets us up for metabolic disease. And that actually can go in and affect the mitochondria as well. So that is going to be causative for insulin resistance as well.
Right on. And that leads into like one thing I want to make sure we hit on, which is toxicity. We just came out of, kind of talking about cancer and cell membrane health as it pertains to cancer, for the ability of the cell to avoid autotoxicity and let good stuff in and bad stuff out. And we talked about receptors when we talked about that. And so the solution largely for things like cancer, the natural support to your immune system, is to clean up the receptors. And the same goes for insulin resistance, is that you can actually have so much personal care products and food and medication and pollution and all these different types of toxins in external toxicity that comes in and actually, will block the receptor site for those insulin receptors to be able to read. And so again, we keep pumping up the insulin, because our body perceives that we need more insulin because the receptors aren't hearing it. So it's like the equivalent of taking earmuffs and putting it on, at a concert. Like you can just keep pumping up the volume, but you can't hear it. Right. And so it's not a matter of we need more, it's a matter of we need to hear better. And that's kind of what's happening with these receptor sites. So I think that's important to understand, that external, and then even if we're not doing a good job of properly clearing toxicity from our body, then we can get this endogenous toxicity, like our cells are unhealthy. So our mitochondrial factory is just gunking up smog, filling up the inside of those cells, really, and then that starts to leak out and then cause the inability of the receptors to be able to hear that way too. So endogenous and exogenous. And then sedentary lifestyle. It's just known that if we move, which is leading us into the solution, if we get our body moving, then it actually increases insulin sensitivity. So just as simple as going out for a walk helps your body better regulate blood sugar and pull you out of insulin resistance by making those receptors a little more capable of being able to hear the insulin as it comes along. So with exercise said, let me hit on two more things, and I'm going to have you dive into just nutrition a little bit more as a solution. Sure. But one of the most basic things, so exercise, when you exercise, you also hydrate if you're doing the right thing, making sure you're replenishing. And something as simple as just adding fluid. So just making sure, we say it all the time, we've done whole episodes on water, so we're going to keep saying it. But, when it comes to all these different conditions, oftentimes we can get half better, right? 50% reduction in symptoms by just hydrating. And so, and in this case, it's as simple as saying that you're going to dilute the bloodstream, all that extra sugar that's in, you're just going to dilute it. And by staying hydrated, you're increasing cellular function, which allows for it to be able to process through the sugar a lot easier. So move your body a little bit, stay hydrated. I know it's like too good to be true, but again, this is the reason why we've accidentally helped a lot of, dysglycemia over the years, is because we're teaching people to do these things as a solution for their other conditions. And then the last thing I was going to say was, because it relates to exercise, nutrition, fluid, is very specifically the reason why there's so much cardiac damage when it comes to dysregulated blood sugar is because as that insulin goes through the roof, then we actually end up decreasing our electrolytes. Okay. And so if we drink, we talk about this all the time. If you drink too much fluid, you decrease your electrolytes, and then that ultimately can cause cardiac problems and damage, right? So we need proper fluid, proper activity levels and replenishment of those fluids, right? Everything needs to be in balance. And so it's appropriate to make sure that you're paying attention to your electrolytes on your blood work and or just incorporating electrolytes into your rehydration plan. And so, and in the I didn't give it as much credence, I guess, as far as supplementation. I always just said, well, if I'm eating what I'm supposed to be eating, I'm having proper recovery meals, et cetera, then I'll have enough electrolytes. But really, it depends on if I did that exercise with or without proper hydration levels determines and of course, the insulin resistance that I'm bringing to the game. Electrolytes become a connector to all of these different pieces and become really important. And so I've been actually paying attention to making sure I've been using salt more appropriately. In fact, I just put salt in my water the other day, some Himalayan salt, like we've recommended for years for people. And I even bought some electrolyte packets to be able to, make sure that I'm keeping my electrolytes balanced throughout the day as a method to preventing any cardiovascular issues. All right. So just a couple of solutions there. Talk to us a little bit more about nutrition, though, as a solution for dysglycemia.
Let me add to that, and it'll tie it into the nutrition,
please.
Because I do think it's important to understand what, you mentioned the high insulin levels affecting electrolytes. Well, actually low insulin affects electrolytes as well. So if you're on the other side of the spectrum and your body goes into ketosis, when your insulin gets very low, then it sends a signal to your kidneys to flush out sodium. And with that, the other minerals go out with that, and hydration goes out with that. So, as one of our strategies, it is a healing strategy to have your body in ketosis. But as clinicians, we have to understand that we have to make sure that we replenish what's being lost. So I think so often people might hear, through the information vines, oh, okay, well, if I'm trying to heal insulin resistance, or I'm trying to lose weight, let me just do keto. But then they may not understand the side effects that are happening with keto. So that's why it's so important to have clinical oversight with nutrition strategies. Nutrition strategies have side effects. We're doing things to, in a sense, manipulate physiology for healing purposes. But if you don't understand what's going on in your body, you're going to feel weak. You're going to feel tired. It can dysregulate other things in the body.
Yes.
The thyroid is something, is sensitive, and you can have thyroid dysregulation, et cetera, et cetera.
In your world, how many times have you seen people that did all these different diets and they're metabolically just wrecked, right, by the time they get to it? And in my world, it's more of the hormones. It's like they do all these different diets and their blood sugar has been all over the place as a part of these different diets, and they kind of half did it and off the wagon and on the wagon. And when they come in, like we run a hormone panel, and it's way worse than we thought it was, just because of kind of Wild West nutrition.
Let me add this piece as well. I meant to say something earlier, but when we look at the blood sugar spectrum, so we have like insulin dependent or type 1 diabetes on the one side, and then we have hypoglycemia on the other side. And I think it would be very easy listening to this conversation and thinking, oh, but I've had diabetes since I was 5 years old. Like, I'm kind of stuck there taking my insulin, and you're stuck. Or you may be on the other side of hypoglycemia and say, oh, well, I am so far from any type of diabetes diagnosis or the repercussions of having insulin resistance. But that could not be further from the truth, because actually hypoglycemia is insulin resistance by definition, because it is the high insulin that causes the blood sugar to drop, or your glucagon's not working properly. So we have our insulin and our glucagon working to bring your body into homeostasis, to regulate your blood glucose. So one of them is not working properly. But I see so often that hypoglycemia is just a step away from a prediabetes or a diabetes diagnosis. So you actually have to categorize it with insulin resistance,
Perfect.
like it is.
Glad you said that, because that when we said, we really meant that this episode is for literally every human being, that is breathing oxygen right now and their heart's beating, right? Like this affects everybody every day. And the last thing I was going to say is that you might have seen people wearing continuous glucose monitors, and this is why, because the glucose affects everybody, and the elite athlete community, the high functioning CEO that needs optimal mental focus, like they're literally talking their doctors into writing them prescriptions for continuous glucose monitors, right? It's because they want optimal performance. So it isn't about the person who's even suffering from the serious inflammation and all that stuff. They just want to have optimal brain glucose usage, right, for function, right? Because the brain loves glucose as a fuel. Like it doesn't want to just go to ketones. They want to figure out, how do I have my carbs, fats, and proteins balanced in such a way that I get optimal brain function or optimal endurance or optimal power if I'm working on a sport that requires that. So anyway, so this blood sugar issue is awesome. It's fascinating. And many people say it's the key to longevity. It's the key to preventing the top diseases. And so we're going to talk a ton more about it in office here. We got workshops coming up. We got webinars coming up. So stay tuned for all of those things. But I think we'll call it a wrap for today. I'm sure we're going to revisit this topic again at some point in the future. And we're always talking about blood sugar on all the other episodes. So if this is interesting to you, then make sure you reach out, ask questions, make sure you reach out for consults. If we talked about something today that triggered you to say, wait a minute, that's me, I need to talk to someone more about this, get some personalized advice, like we said, please make sure you do that. Otherwise, we will see you next time. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for joining us today on True Health Solutions Podcast. Make sure that you click to subscribe. Also, go to our website, www.truehealthcharlotte.com, where you can download any resources related to today's show or any future shows. And lastly, if you search for True Health Center Group on Facebook, you'll be able to join our free health community. We look forward to seeing you there.